because I didn't have my mic on. Sorry about that, I just turned it off. So quality of life in the community is important, and I think if you have a little better understanding of what we can or can't do regarding traffic and what we do and have done in the past, it will help you as you move forward with those thought processes. So, thanks.
Well, I put some slides together just to get the discussion going tonight. Brian and I, as he said, did talk about this a little bit. And we work with several cities throughout Oregon in a role where we start with the big picture transportation system plan and then partner with the city reviewing traffic impact studies and things like that. So these are just kind of my thoughts on what I frequently hear people ask about and trying to put some context to the discussion. But I'm certainly more than happy to just answer questions you have as we go through. So I thought we would start kind of big picture back to 2009, 2010, when we put the transportation system plan together. And the first part you'll see on the left side of the slide there is the comprehensive plan goal around the transportation system. And I always want to point that out because the comprehensive plan is where this all starts. It's the guiding document for the city. That's where the land use was developed that we are trying to support with the transportation plan. So that initial goal is what really drives all of this. And then I listed on the screen there all of the different goals that we use to build the transportation system plan. So you see livability right up front. That's the quality of life component. But there's other things in here as well as economic vitality. How do you balance supporting economic growth with livability issues? That's always a point of tension as we're putting those plans together. Providing quality design, providing reliability for traveling through the city. Those are all different criteria we use to put those together. So that's just a bit of background. So the next slide, one of the questions we often get when we do those long-range plans, these are built for a 20-year horizon. So in this case, we were looking out to the year 2030. So what land use were we trying to accommodate when we put that transportation system plan together? On the household side, we're planning for about 4,400 new households to be developed in the city over that 20-year horizon, and slightly more number of jobs, about 4,600 jobs to be developed over that time. So an awful significant amount of growth that was built into that plan, and we had to develop the framework to serve that. Important note about those transportation system plans, they don't detail out exactly every little thing you have to do to meet that growth. It's a pretty high level, what's the framework you need, and then the later studies that we do pinpoint the details. Okay. So that was the land use side of it.
Can we interrupt anywhere
anytime.
along the line? Because here we are in 2017. So projected growth from 2009 to 2030, 4,403. Do you know where we are today from 2009 to today?
Good question. I'd have to look at Brian, but since we finished the plan of the impact studies we've done, there's probably been at least several hundred new homes approved, but I don't recall that it's reached 1,000 yet.
That's about as good as I could do, is that we've got over 200 new homes in this time frame, and then 2.7 people per unit. So that would give you how many new people generally have probably come in.
So when we talk about new homes, are those single-family homes? Are they duplexes? Are they apartments?
This was a mix of all, so this is just one aggregate number, but what I recall the details was the majority of it was single family, probably 80% of it was single family at least, but I would have to go back into the details of the plan to give you a specific number.
You know, I don't have a really good feel, but I'd say we may be just slightly lower than the projection that's happening here, because we've had a slow period since 2010, and now we're quickly catching up, and so we're another year or so, I'm sure we'll be right on the path to implementing this.
I don't know what the reality is, but I think this is my fourth or fifth year on the planning commission, and we've approved a dump truck load of new development, whether it's apartment buildings. They just aren't online yet in a lot of ways, much like the project down on Territorial and whatever the one is that we just approved. So it feels like, there's a tidal wave of folks, because the traffic is a tidal wave either way. So
Yeah.
unless they're driving multiple cars at the same time.
In my observation on the number of homes that have developed, that kind of few hundred that I'm guesstimating, there's been quite a few applications that have come through that have been fairly modest in size. To get to this 4,000 number, this is where the North Redwood area or the development south of town that you were talking about, those large, dozens of acres sort of developments, those are the big ones that would have to come online to see this amount of growth. All right, so the next slide is a graphic that we had in the transportation plan, and this is just a snapshot of the travel model that we use when we're building those that takes homes and employment and regional growth, people traveling through town, and we modeled for all the roadways in the city, what's the anticipated growth in traffic. So the thickness of the line that you see on the map is the amount of traffic growth expected. So the big line kind of diagonally through the city, that's 99E, of course, where the most growth is anticipated. But you can see on the north end, Territorial and Holly, of course, having some growth. The industrial area on the east side of town, quite a few thick lines as that area would build out. So that just was put there to show you that growth was anticipated to happen all around town. And so the analysis we did was built to try to help you best serve that growth. Okay. All right. The next slide is talking about what constraints we had to work with. Easy to fix all of the needs that are out there if there's unlimited amount of money. So when we were building this plan, as we were brainstorming solutions, trying to meet all the needs, we were easily over $100 million, probably $150 million in improvements that you would consider to meet all those needs. But when we did our funding forecast, we only had about $36 million to work with. And
We
so-
know what that is now. Is that 36 million, is that a current figure? I mean, this looks like from 2009.
Yeah, that was from 2009, and that was a projection of the fixed kind of revenue streams the city gets, gas tax money, things like that, but also system development charges that you would collect as development occurs. So because the first few years after we did the plan were a little slower for development, you're probably a little behind pace. But as Brian said, as that development is picking up, the system development charges will come with it and probably put you right back on pace.
But that would still leave us 64 million short?
Correct. Yep. And so what was adopted in the plan was a list of projects that aligned with the 36 million and still met all of the standards for the amount of congestion that would be there on the system. It didn't put a sidewalk and a bike lane on every single road that would need one. It didn't solve every single safety.
It did or did not?
Did not.
Okay.
It did not solve every single safety concern, but it solved the priority ones that were identified through our community engagement process and working with our city partners. So that's just a little background on how we built that plan. So then it was adopted in late 2010, early 2011, and then you're into implementation mode. So what happens as growth occurs? So there's two main things that happen as cities manage this growth and congestion starts to happen. One is there's a set of improvement projects, the capital improvement plan. Those are generally projects that aren't tied to a specific development. They tend to be larger projects, things the city or the county or ODOT would want to implement to serve the greater community. And so every year, the city council sets their budgets, those CIP lists are reviewed, and those get implemented over time. We were talking about the sidewalks and bike lanes on 3rd and 4th earlier. That's an example of a project that wasn't a specific developer that built it. It was a city capital improvement project. So as development occurs, as the years go on, that's one of those things that the city has to monitor and make sure the right priorities are still floating to the top of the list that responds to community needs and where development's happening. Okay. So that's one piece of it. The next big piece, and these are the traffic studies you've been seeing a lot of from us, are when a conforming use comes in, and by that I mean somebody that's consistent with the comp plan and the zoning. We do a traffic impact study that looks at what are they adding to the system at the year of opening. We consider it a short-term build-out. Usually it's 1 or 2 years into the future as their development happens. And with that, we're checking a few things. One, how much traffic is it? Is that consistent with what was planned for in that transportation system plan? Is the level of congestion consistent with that? We look at delay as one of the main measures for that, and I listed kind of the rules of thumb for what your standards are for your intersection delay. We also take a careful look at safety. Are the access points going to be safe? Are there any safety issues in the area where if you add traffic to it, it would compound those safety concerns? And we look at multimodal safety. Can people walk and bike safely through the site or from the system onto the site? So those are all things that we do with those studies, and that's that kind of fine focused look that we do that goes in more detail than what the TSP was able to. The other thing that we added with the implementing code when we did the TSP update was directly related to community livability, and that was an acknowledgement of if developments come in and they add significant traffic volume to a residential street, so a lower classification street that has homes fronting it, that impact, while it may meet congestion standards, may not meet the needs of the residents that live there. So we've done a few studies for you that have a neighborhood through traffic study as a component to it. And so there's a level of traffic volume and a speed volume that we apply to that and look and see, is that a level of volume or speed that's generally considered livable for a residential street, or if it exceeds that, how do you manage it? So that's a unique component that Canby has incorporated that not all communities do. Okay. So that's what the majorities of study you see are. There are some that we call non-conforming for the purposes of traffic, but that means it's not consistent with your zoning or your comprehensive plan. And so for us, when we're looking back...
What would be an example of that?
If there was a residentially zoned property that came in and said, we now want to be commercial. And so we look back to the transportation system plan and we modeled it. We said, well, we thought there was going to be 10 houses there, but now you're talking about a convenience store. That's a whole different level of traffic. And so there's the Oregon administrative rules, transportation planning rule, TPR is the acronym that we always talk about. And that requires you to do a long-range study. You're basically going back to your adopted transportation plan and saying, with this change in intensity, are you triggering something different that needs to be accounted for? So it's not just a compliance check, it's really a step back and say, are the long-range plans still valid? Okay. So that's the long-range studies we get into. So those are important to make sure your plan is going according to what the community needs. And then the other thing we do to help manage growth over time is those TSPs that are a 20-year forecast, that's just a best estimate of a likely scenario in 20 years. Crystal ball is not perfect, right? So as things change, there's actually guidelines out there that say you should update your plan every 5 to 10 years because as development changes, funding needs might change, community preferences might change. You need to go back and revisit this and make sure we're still on the right path.
And so the last time that this was 2009, 2010, is that correct?
Yeah, I believe
So
it was adopted early.
Yeah, we're 7 years
11.
into the process.
Correct. Yeah. So you're in that window of if a lot of development's happening and things are changing, you might want to think about a plan update. Okay. So that's an important step in the whole process to make sure you're responding to the community needs. And then the last thing I listed is something that I tend to see larger communities do this, and at the county level, this happens a lot, and that's a formal monitoring program. If you drive on county roads, a lot of times you'll see the tubes across the road every summer. That's their annual monitoring program where they're saying what's happening on the system. Is it growing as we thought? Are our needs shifting? And that's a cost item that a community can take on, but it really helps you know, again, are things going according to plan? One of the, I think the nice things for Canby that's happened with the number of applications you've had around the city, you've been getting some of that monitoring just from those traffic impact studies. We've been doing counts all around the community as we're doing those traffic studies, so you've kind of by default had some monitoring built in. Okay. All right. So again, that's just kind of the overview of how that management system works. Brian mentioned to me there's a couple roadways, and these relate to recent studies we've done as well, that came up as talking points, so I thought I'd just put some information together. One of which was Territorial Road, and as more and more applications come through on the north side of town, how much growth is really expected there? When does it get to be too much? So the background, starting with just traffic volume, when we developed the transportation system plan, of course the volume varies based on where you're at on the corridor, but generally it was about 4,000 or 5,000 cars a day across that corridor. In the long-range plan, getting out to the year 2030, that volume was forecasted to basically double, 7,000 to 11,000 cars a day, depending on where you're at on the corridor. So a fair amount of growth happening with all that conforming use. With that, the transportation plan did identify it's a significant roadway. It had a collector designation, which arterials at the top, collectors the next tier down, and then you get into local streets. And so it would be a roadway where you want continuous sidewalks and continuous bike lanes, but we did see with that level of traffic volume, it would still only have one lane in each direction. However, as individual developments come in, you often check their access points or major intersections to see at that spot, do you need a turn lane? Do you get enough congestion where that's really warranted? Okay. So that's a little bit of background about Territorial. The most recent study we've done up there, we measured the traffic volumes this year, and it's at about 5,000 cars a day right now. So in that spot where it's 5,000, it was probably 4,500 when we did the transportation system plan. So it's grown a bit, and you've seen some of that. Honestly, with the amount of development up there, my guess would be that traffic volume increase is not so much the direct development that has happened, but more kind of regional. As we've come out of the recession and the economy has recovered, we've seen this across the entire Portland metropolitan area. There was what I would call latent or kind of pent-up demand when the unemployment rates were higher and people weren't traveling as much. And just in the last 18 months, we've seen almost 10% increases across the board in traffic volumes on all the major corridors. I can tell you my commute daily from Sherwood to downtown Portland went up by almost 50% in travel time just with that kind of regional recovery. So
I travel from Canby to north down into the industrial district. 27 miles last Friday was a 2-hour one-way trip. 27 miles.
So that's that economic recovery that you're seeing the effect of. So both your local development activity is starting to pick up, but you're also experiencing that regional traffic. So it probably has a perception of, in a very short amount of time, a significant change.
I think that one of the things, and we've discussed this here, is that you're dead right about how much traffic has increased on I-5, but think about the same thing maybe on Territorial or even 99. The reason that a lot of that traffic is on Territorial has little to do with the development as yet, because that's not been done yet. It's coming off of 99 at Territorial, going down to 22nd and Birch, and going up Birch, which is a quiet little, at one time, quiet little residential street. And so I think that what we're experiencing is going right back to that livability factor. That's our concern here, and so instead of waiting until such time as, could have had a V8 and a left-hand turn lane, why are we not, I mean, it's very clear to, I think, most folks that as things progress, with all of the influx of people coming into Clackamas County and using 99, those are the things that I think that we should be anticipating now. That's not in our purview. I mean, people come to us with, here, we want to develop this lot, or we want to build apartments, and our job is to say, does it meet the code? We say, yes, it does, and, God bless you, go build. But that's our job, but our fear is that every time we do that, we're increasing a problem, we're stressing that system where, that left-hand turn lane with those, apartments, those 58 units, it's 58 or 58 units are going to go down there on Territorial. It's going to be filled with kids, and there's going to be bus stops, and it's a one-way street, and and a morning commute coming off of that. It is a mess. If they were having that commute at 10 o'clock or 10:30 in the morning, no sweat. But everybody's trying to get there at 6:30, 7 o'clock, 7:30 in the morning, and so that's where your livability factor comes in right to the forefront. So that if the 4,000 or 5,000 car trips were spread out evenly across the entire 12 hours of the day, that might be okay. But it's crammed into hour 90 minutes in the morning and 90 minutes in the afternoon, and so the livability factor for all concerned, the drivers, the residents, those are the things that concern, well, at least concern me, and I think we've talked about that here in this forum. So I would hope that we would be anticipating that rather than waiting 3 more years for that 10-year time frame for an update to go, okay, we can see this train coming down the track. We even see the light coming through the tunnel at a very high rate of speed. Maybe we should do something about it now. That makes sense to me, though.
Yeah, and it's a tough balancing act, because in the end, certain roads have to carry the traffic if it's coming through. And so the higher designated facilities, Territorial being a collector, you would expect it to have more traffic on it than, let's say, Birch, which is my next couple of slides. That's a lower classification facility. That's a neighborhood route. So the intent is that Birch would not be as much of a through route as Territorial. Obviously, it's part of that cut through right now. So there's an issue happening that we know about. But in the end, those facilities like Territorial, we need the bike lanes and sidewalks and safe crossings and safe access points. So does that traffic spike in those mornings or evening periods happen? It is safe to be there. There might be more traffic and more noise, and that environmental ambiance isn't as desirable as a lower speed or lower volume facility, but we have to balance that somehow. Yeah, but let's talk about Birch, and that might help with that discussion. So on the next slide, this is actually kind of interesting for me to pull out this graphic that's on the slide there. Almost probably 10 years ago, actually no, maybe close to 15 years ago, we were doing some work up in Vancouver, Washington. And back in that era of traffic engineering, neighborhood traffic calming was all the rage. These studies were going on all over Oregon, Washington, and everybody was concerned about, how do I get speed bumps put on my road? Every community was dealing with that. Everybody wanted to slow people down, kick them out of the neighborhoods. And so we did some research in detail in Vancouver, looking at the relationship between the width of local streets, the resulting speeds of traffic driving on there, and what were the residents' perception of livability when that happened. And so the plot we put down here was charting on the bottom, we have local street width, so 20-foot wide street on the left, up to some of those local streets in Vancouver were 65 feet wide. I was doing field work one time and driving 25 miles an hour down one of those streets and got passed on both sides. About 40. So that was kind of the range of issues they were dealing with. But we found this very strong relationship between that street width, and it's kind of the visual feel you have as a driver. When it's narrower, it's tighter, you tend to slow down more. And what we plotted here was what percent of the vehicles are going 30 miles an hour or higher. So what we found was on those streets, the residents felt like it's posted 25, we're comfortable at 25, we're okay walking, having kids, riding bikes. But when you have a lot of people going 30, 35, 40 miles an hour, that's a different situation. So that was kind of a real livability tipping point for those communities. The other thing to keep in mind, there's the true safety side of the research. One of the big concerns is what happens if a pedestrian gets hit. 20 miles an hour or lower, there's a decent chance of survival. You start getting up above 30 miles an hour, it's pretty tough. So that 30 miles an hour is a pretty important tipping point. Okay? So what we found through that research was roads that are 32 feet wide, maybe 36 feet wide, are in a pretty comfortable place for what the speeds are likely to be if you have on-street parking. And those were considered livable. Birch, it's about 40 feet curb to curb. And so you may have heard complaints of cars driving too fast on Birch as a cut-through route. Wouldn't surprise me based on what I've seen of data in other communities. Okay. So that's a little bit of background just for you on the technical side. So the next slide is, what can you do about it? So Brian was telling me that there's recently some speed cushions that have gone in, kind of the more gradual humps versus the parking lot bumps. Those are pretty good at getting people to go close to the speed limit, 25 miles an hour. So that's one step you can take. If Birch still continues to be that problem, you're going to be asking yourselves, what more can we do? Because then it becomes a traffic volume problem, not just a speed problem. And so in the end, if you really need to push that further and really do something about it, there's other treatments where you might look at that system up there and say, really, Birch shouldn't be connected to Territorial up at the top. However, you want people to walk and bike, you want emergency vehicles to get through. So there's options where you can put diagonal curbs across the intersections and shut traffic down, but have a gap that fire trucks can straddle and get through, other cars couldn't. There's those sorts of tools in the toolbox that come into play, but you have to take a pretty holistic view of the network when you get to that level of mitigation, because you might just shift that from one neighborhood street to another instead of shifting it from a neighborhood street to a collector or arterial. And so you have to look at those things pretty carefully and balance it out.
I'm glad you use Birch as an example, because I drive down Birch a minimum of twice a day because I live on 22nd. Birch is the way to go. Bob Backstrom, who actually lives on Birch, was the impetus behind the speed humps there. And I can tell you for a fact that the speed humps, at least since they've been installed, I think that's been about 4 or 5 months now, have had a good effect of slowing folks down. And I don't know if it's really decreased the amount of traffic, but I think that it has at least a little bit. So yeah, that worked out. Who knows, over time people will be going, flying over those speed humps. And Bob, what's been your experience?
Well, John, it's only been a month since they've been installed.
It seems much longer.
And the original plan was for a speed hump about every 250 feet, because that's how you really control the traffic. And Birch ended up, it's a half mile and only 4 speed humps. So I can tell you that there's 2 on my block, and they are absolutely miraculous. They have made a huge difference in the noise and the speed and everything. That's only 1 block on the whole length of Birch. So if I had my brothers, we would have done it the way it was originally recommended. So, but it has definitely been a benefit. Now, one more thing I'd like to add, if you don't mind. So I've lived there since 1988. In 1990, they widened that street and thought they were doing all of us a favor, and all of a sudden we're getting all this traffic. So the neighbors started following these people coming off of Knightsbridge, coming down Birch, going on Territorial Road to 99. And we found, and we still find, that roughly 3 out of every 4 vehicles coming in the evening through Birch Street and that route don't even live in Canby. They just keep on going right through town. And living where I do, I get lots of people stopping, asking directions, having car trouble, this and that. They're on the way to McMinnville, they're going to Salem, they're going to Wilsonville. They don't want to stay on 205 because the 205 I-5 intersection, sometimes you come to a stop. They say, you know, we may get there faster on the freeway, but when we go this way, we never have to stop. There's only 1 stop sign in the whole trip. So anyway, you're absolutely right on that, but I don't know. That's why I appealed to these guys earlier. We need to start taking a more proactive vision, and instead of just doing traffic studies, we need to do livability studies. And I realize livability is a very subjective thing and difficult to measure, but we need to have that on the tip of our tongue and be looking at when we proceed. And this really is encouraging to me. I thank you guys for doing that.
So that sort of look at things could be part of your next TSP update. You could have a component of that work program that flags which roadways are likely to be problematic that way as development occurs, and what are the range of tools you can use. The speed humps, well documented through research to slow people down. I'm glad to hear that the noise hasn't been too bad, because that's one of the counterpoints to them that I've often heard is if you live right next to it, you hear that da-dun, 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 and that annoys some people. So the other thing that often happens is they use the radar driver speed feedback signs. It flashes at you if you're going too fast. So you don't have the noise impact. Those have actually been found for most people that are speeding to slow them down just as much as the speed humps do.
Radar things?
Yep. However, if you're someone that really knows you're speeding and wants to speed, then it doesn't slow you down. So there is still that percentage of the driver population that it doesn't target. Yeah.
My experience is, because if my wife were sitting here, she would say, you know, she could wallpaper our room with the speeding tickets that I've gotten over since I moved to Canby. That's not quite true, but I have my fair share. And, but in my old age, I've managed to slow down. But I think that with the speed bumps, the speed humps, as with a stop sign, are physical barriers that tell people, you know, slow down. The digital thing, if you're, you know, listening to music or you just blow right through them, and that's, you know, I pay attention because, well, now I have to. But so I'm more in favor of, personally, of the physical obstacles to speeding, because the digital ones are.
And if speed humps aren't the right solution, there are other things like mini roundabouts at intersections that you don't have to widen for, but you can fit them in the footprint, especially in a roadway that's 40 feet wide. You could probably fit them in. That'll slow people down going through the corridor. So there's a lot of tools that you can use. The other thing I've heard some communities dealing with is with modern apps that route people through communities. There are some apps that put people on these cut-through routes. It's the fastest way, and more people are learning about them. So there are communities that have had direct outreach to some of the vendors of those apps to talk about removing those corridors from their guidance systems.
We've had that conversation with Google and Birch, as it relates to Birch, and to no avail. Canby, Oregon, Google,
It can be tough.
Go ahead.
Yep, yep.
Oh, the $36 million figure you cited here early in your presentation.
Yeah.
Does that take into account just growth, or is it street improvements, replacing alligator asphalt? The streets have a lifespan, just like everything, have to be replaced.
Very good question. I'll specify. So that 36 million was what we anticipated would be available for building new projects.
New projects.
So there's also gas tax money and other sources that go to maintenance, preservation. That's not part of the 36 million. Good question. Okay. So that's what I had to share just to get the dialogue going. Are there more questions that triggered for you?
I think one of the best counters to speeding is if anybody's driven down through Milwaukee at 99E is that dreaded white van that they have. I mean, I am tremendously cautious as I'm coming north, going down that hill. I try to get over in the left lane and look and see if I can, over by the railroad trestle, I can see that white van. And generally, if you watch the brake lights of the cars ahead, when they all start coming red, you got a pretty good idea that van is there, and they use it at the north side of town going south too, where the splits off to go up out to Estacada. I understand we cannot use one of those in city streets in Canby, but we could out on 99E because it's a state highway. But I'll tell you, that is a definite deterrent.
Yeah, I mean, with most transportation solutions, we'll talk about the 3 E's. There's the engineering, the new projects, enforcement, and education. You know, how do we help the community be aware of these different situations? And sometimes the people speeding are our neighbors, and we just have to talk about it, right? Yeah.
Well, I know that I've slowed down since Bob got on me about it. So he's politely informed me numerous times that speed limit is 25 miles an hour. Please pay attention. So, yeah.
So one more thought I have is if that traffic calming, the mitigations for speeding and volume on residential streets, if that really does become a common conversation for you and there's more and more requests for those types of projects, just remember to think about not shifting the problem from one spot to another. And there's communities out there that have some processes and plans to go through to make sure you're doing that the right way, kind of the right system approach to it. And like I said, 15 years ago when traffic calming was all the rage, a lot of those plans got put together and they kind of got shelved when nobody really wanted to go through that process. But just be aware those guidelines are out there. If
That was one thing I was wondering about Birch, since we've installed the bumps along there now. Just going to push it over to Holly, where people will go down 9th or 10th and then up Holly or Ivy to bypass those.
Yeah, and
Shift the misery around.
correct. But if I remember the functional class designations correctly, I think Holly is a higher class roadway. It's probably a collector. So it would be intended to carry more of that traffic. So if you did an analysis of it and that is where it shifted to, if you live there, you might not like to hear that story, but that's what the system design would have you do.
So what is the latest, if traffic calming is no longer the rage, but we can anticipate a lot more traffic, so how are we going to control that? I mean, having 7,000 cars going up and down Birch in the year 2030, or even 2025, seems very unreasonable to me. So this is your area of expertise.
Yeah.
So what do you guys?
So what's changing?
Yeah. So what's changing? What's going to work for us?
Well, I think the major shift in the industry that I would share is really thinking about urban design and placemaking has come a long way in the last 15 years. And it used to be very common to build a wider roadway. People wanted to drive fast. That was the predominant decision. And so as funding has gotten tighter and you had to worry about first maintaining all that pavement, and then you started to think about what are you really creating for that livability environment? What's safest to walk and bike on? and get people out of their cars and provide a safer system. Most communities are adopting narrower streets. They're allowing more congestion, so you're not adding lanes just for cars and impacting the safety for pedestrians and bicycles. And so that's the real trade-off that's been happening, particularly in the Northwest and a bit across the nation.
So you're trading off safety for congestion, is that what I heard you
Yeah.
say?
A lot of times you would allow more congestion to make things safer. And it's not always that straightforward, but oftentimes, adding a right turn lane at an intersection where bicycles might be coming through, that can be challenging to design for well, whereas if you didn't add the turn lane and accepted more congestion, that could be better. So it's a tough balancing act, and so every situation, every project you go to design, you have to weigh those things and decide what's really best for the community. So again, as you look for your next plan update, if that sort of neighborhood livability is of top priority, I would highly encourage you to be talking to your staff about that and making sure that's an area of emphasis to your transportation plan update.
I think that we'll be talking to the city council. We have a workshop coming up on the 17th with the city council. Is that the right date, Brian? The 17th?
Yeah, of course, that's got a topic already assigned to it with the land needs analysis, so there probably won't be too much opportunity to talk about something else.
There'll be an opportunity to at least get the conversation started. Maybe, say, maybe we need.
One more word, please.
Sure.
I truly believe that if the citizens of Canby used the streets of Canby, there would not be a problem that we have now. The problem is people who are coming from Portland and Milwaukee and Oregon City and cutting through our town. If we could stop that from happening or dramatically reduce it, we wouldn't be having talks about speed humps or anything. The people who are causing the problem, flying in our That's not always the case in other cities, I know that, but in this particular cut through, and on south side.
Thank you very much for your.
Can I ask one last question?
Absolutely.
Since we do so many of these traffic studies for you, as we're preparing those, are there any things we could do differently as we put those studies together to help you grapple with this issue?
Can I answer the question? As traffic volumes go up, is there suitable speed changes that should occur? In other words, as the number of cars goes up, should the speed come down? Or is the current 30 mile an hour, is the current 30 mile an hour a suitable speed given the number of cars in your opinion?
That's a good question. Normally, measuring speeds and expecting that to change significantly as growth happens isn't part of the process. In general, it's really the width of the facility and the urban kind of environment you're in. Are there buildings up tight? Are there street trees? What's that visual field? That affects the speed more than just a change in traffic volume. Unless you're getting so much congestion, you just can't drive fast, and that'll slow people down. But outside of 99E, you're probably not going to have that much congestion that really slows people down. That being said, if you're hearing that there are roadways where people tend to drive significantly faster than the speed limit, that is a data point that could be collected in traffic studies. You could ask for us to survey the traffic speeds and report that, along with the volumes and capacity analysis that we do. So that would be something that, talking with staff, maybe as you hear those things, you could kind of create a log of known hotspots, and we could be aware of that as we're scoping studies.
Any further questions? Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And Jordan, you were just a fountain of information there.
That's my job.
Jordan Sharp, she delivers most of these studies, so
Okay.
she takes care of you.
Okay, well, that's good. Any other questions? Tyler, do you have any input?
No, once we start getting some potential solutions, I'll certainly want to discuss those.
Any further questions?
Thank you very
Again,
much.
thank you
Yeah, thank you.
so much. So I think we're, oh, it's, yeah, bypass. Take the ferry, you know. We're gonna reopen the Willamette River, the Malala River down there. And yes,
One question, gentlemen, before we close up, I could ask him, what would your sort of professional sort of expectations be on the impact to Canby if there was a bridge put over that river somewhere near the Canby Ferry? Just ballpark, just start spitballing.
Oh, I don't know that I could put a professional judgment opinion on that. I know when we did the transportation plan, we tested a bridge to the west, looking at the balance between Knightsbridge and the highway, and certainly a new corridor has potential to bring significant demand in. But the details of how that actually connects and what you're going to see,
So do you think in general it would increase the overall traffic in Canby, or would it just redirect it and reroute it?
it has potential to go either way, depending on what it really connects to. Yeah.
thank you very much. Hope to see you again. Brian, thank you very much
Great.
for facilitating this. And we'll see you on the 17th.